So I'm going to just speak a little briefly about research engagement at the nonprofit that I work at, the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. And I should probably add, I am located in Philadelphia. Our offices are in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I work primarily remotely in Philadelphia, and my training is as a clinical psychologist. So for anyone who's not familiar with frontotemporal degeneration, or FTD, it's an umbrella term for a group of closely related progressive neurodegenerative disorders. They often include degeneration of the frontal and temporal lobes, hence the term, and often characterized by protein pathologies like tau and TDP43, amongst others. We estimate that there's about 60,000 people in the US with FTD, but we think that's probably a pretty big underestimation because it's very difficult to get a diagnosis. It is a common cause of young onset dementia. And right now there are no FDA symptomatic or disease modifying approved treatments. And just to get a little bit more detailed, many people are generally diagnosed with an FTD disorder based on the clinical presentation, so what they look like. A confirmed diagnosis really can only be made at autopsy, but generally they sort of look like one of these three categories, at least at the beginning. So behavioral variant FTD, which the majority of people that we work with, over 50%, are generally diagnosed with, that's often characterized by behavior and personality changes. Then there's a host of disorders that are characterized by initially language changes. And there's several different types of primary progressive aphasia, depending on the type of language dysfunction. And then there's a few different diagnoses for disorders that are primarily motor functioning disorders. So corticobasal syndrome, progressive supranuclear palsy, and FTD with ALS. C9orf72 is sort of the shared genetic underpinning there. But we have found that a lot of people, kind of depending on what their initial diagnosis is, whether that's FTD or ALS, kind of sends them in different paths. And that's part of why we're really interested in participating in this kind of initiative, to make sure that we're really collaborating with folks who are focused on ALS, because we're so focused on FTD and there's so many shared challenges there. And I should also mention, although people generally fall into one of these categories at the beginning when they're initially diagnosed, over time, for many folks, additional domains become impacted. So someone may initially have behavioral variant FTD, but often they will begin to exhibit changes in language and motor functioning and cognition. And at the end of life, many people sort of have the same set of symptoms, regardless of what initial diagnosis they were given. So the group that I work for, AFTD, our mission is to improve the quality of life of people affected by FTD and drive research to a cure. We are the only nonprofit patient advocacy organization focused specifically on FTD. And we have a number of different departments. I'm housed in the research department, where we promote and fund research, we convene researchers, but there are a lot of other colleagues that are working on things that I think would be of interest to you. So we can see over time if we want to bring any of them in. We have, for example, an advocacy team that's really focused on policy and making sure that things like FTD and ALS are being included in funding. We do a lot of public awareness, information and support. We have a lot of support groups across the country. And we provide a lot of education, especially to healthcare providers, because we recognize that healthcare providers are kind of the gatekeepers for a lot of this. We also have a helpline. So if you have any questions, that information will be at the end of this. And you can always go to our website for more information about this organization. So research engagement, which is what I'm primarily concerned about. Essentially, they created my position about a year ago because historically, there have not been clinical trials for FTD, and there weren't really pharmaceutical companies involved in this space. And in the last few years, there's been an explosion in opportunities. So they really wanted to bring on someone who could be really focused on ensuring that the lived experience of FTD was being taken into consideration when these trials were being designed. So some of our ground truths and our kind of guiding principles when it comes to research engagement, we have, there's a separate LLC called the FTD Disorders Registry, and that is a self-report registry. There are about 5,000 people in it right now, and people can opt to be in the registry to be contacted about research opportunities, or to participate directly in research through the registry. And both AFTD and the registry are aligned in wanting to empower the voice of people directly impacted by FTD. We want to make sure that what matters to people with lived experience is understood by researchers. We think that research needs to be conducted in a way that's accessible and in keeping with the priorities of people impacted by FTD. And we think people impacted by FTD have the right to make informed decisions about participating in research. And a lot of that comes down to what I think Danielle was talking about in terms of understanding basic science, understanding what's going on. So we do a lot of educating and trying to figure out, what does this community want to know about? Do we need to put together some resources on things like gene modifying therapies? And I also understand there's a lot that's already been done. As Danielle mentioned, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Have other organizations found a really good way of presenting this material in a way that's digestible and understandable? And can we borrow that or replicate it? So along these lines, we're really committed to capturing what matters to people directly impacted by FTD. We have been around for 20 years this year. And so we do have deep connections with people impacted by FTD, which gives us the ability to do things like convene focus groups, advisory panels, bring guest speakers. And so we do kind of have the ear of the pharmaceutical companies right now, because we have these inroads with people directly impacted. And this is completely new territory for us. We know it's not new for everybody. So we want to learn how other organizations and other individuals have navigated things like relationships with pharmaceutical companies, because we want these companies to understand the lived experience. We also last year held an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting for FTD. And if you're not familiar with the PFDD initiative, I would encourage you to just Google FDA, PFDD. But essentially, the FDA started this initiative to come up with a systematic way of ensuring they were hearing directly from people impacted by different diseases and disorders. So we held a PFDD meeting last March. It was virtual because of COVID. We had over 550 participants, and it included things like testimonials from people with FTD and their loved ones, panel discussion, people calling in. We had live polling and a pre-meeting survey that I'll talk about in a moment. And the video of this meeting is available on our website, as well as the voice of the patient report. We don't tend to use the word patient, but this is an FDA term. When you have a PFDD meeting, they ask for basically a summary document about what were some of the themes that came up. What are people saying matters to them? And that is also available on our website. In preparation for the meeting, we deployed what's called the FTD Insight Survey. So we worked with our registry to put together a survey to kind of supplement the narratives that we heard during the meeting. We had 1,800 responses from people diagnosed, as well as people at genetic risk, caregivers, and we covered all sorts of topics, including, what is their specific diagnosis, about family history, perspectives on research, what kinds of treatments have they tried so far. And we coordinated with a lot of the different patient advocacy organizations, including the ALS Association, to ensure that what we were including in our voice of the patient report that summarized both the meeting and the survey kind of reflected everyone's shared understanding of these various disorders. So we have all of this great information that we've gotten both from this formal meeting that we held, from this survey that we deployed. I also have a lot of informal conversations with people in our network, our volunteers, just to better understand what their experiences have been. What are their perspectives on things like genetic counseling, on brain donation? Have they had good experience with research? Have they had less than optimal experiences? And we're kind of taking all that information And we're doing a number of things with it. One is informing the research and clinical communities so that they understand the lived experience. We do that through participating in professional conferences, in publications, in having meetings with pharmaceutical companies to say, this is what people are saying about things like how far they're willing to travel for a clinical trial, or what side effects they're willing to undergo or endure. We also every year, kind of some hiccups with COVID, but we were able to host a meeting last December, a hybrid meeting, which we call the FTD Treatment Study Group meeting. And this is a meeting where we bring together the FDA, pharmaceutical companies, academic researchers, and luckily, because I was involved this year, we were able to bring some people with FTD to the meeting to really have a pre-competitive, collaborative conversation about research in FTD and how we can move forward. And we were able to bring both people with FTD to talk about their experiences and also some of this community-wide data to really say to the FDA, this is what people are saying, this is what they want, this is what the urgent unmet medical need is in this community. We've also used the survey and the meeting to help us better understand what are the educational needs of our constituency. So back to what Danielle was saying about basic science. So we use this, we've been doing webinars, but we know there's better ways of communicating some of this information. You know, maybe we should be having minute-long videos that people can just click on our website. So we're really interested in understanding how people digest scientific information and what the best way to convey this information is. As I mentioned, the FDA requires what they call a voice of the patient report after a patient-focused drug development meeting, which summarizes that meeting. So we have this document that goes to the FDA that really outlines, to the best of our ability, the lived experience of FTD. And they use this document, or they can use it to make regulatory decisions. So they can see things like what people's quotes were about, like I said, about side effects, you know, what side effects people are willing to endure. And they can use that when they're making their decisions. And then another area that overlaps a lot with ALS is trying to understand the tools that are being used in clinical trials and in research to determine whether something is effective or not. We want to make sure those tools tap into what matters to this community. You know, are these treatments targeting the symptoms that are most distressing for people? And how do we deal with the fact that FTD is very heterogeneous? People can look very, very different and still have this diagnosis. We also know there are a lot of trials going on with both FTD and ALS in the same trial. How do we make sure that the tools that are being used to measure whether these treatments have been effective work for both of these groups? So getting near the end here, some of the challenges and opportunities that we're currently facing. One is we're very excited that there are industry academic researchers actually doing clinical trials, both for symptoms of FTD, as well as actually looking at disease modifying therapies. We know from the FTD Insight Survey that a lot of people really want to participate in research. We get about 80% of people that we've surveyed said, I am very willing to participate in research if that opportunity was accessible for me. We have the FTD Disorders Registry, which is a strong partner, allows us to connect to people diagnosed, to their loved ones, and also connect them to researchers. And we're a growing organization, which is, we have about 32 people now, about 12 people have come on in the last year, and we're looking to hire about 25 more people. And that just expands what we're able to do because we have more bandwidth. And there's a lot of promising biomarker research underway. We don't have a blood test now for FTD or anything like that, but we feel like we're getting closer, which is very exciting. And other patient advocacy organizations have encountered a lot of the same challenges and opportunities. And again, part of why I want to meet with people like everyone on this call is to understand how other people have navigated this. It's all very, very new for our organization and our disease, but it's not new for everyone else. So we want to learn from others. Some of the challenges are that FTD looks really different from person to person, and the trajectory can be really different. Some people progress really quickly. Others can live with FTD for a very long time. There's also not a direct one-to-one relationship between the underlying pathophysiology, so what the proteins, the genetic causes, and in what it looks like clinically. But most of the trials are targeting the underlying pathophysiology. So a trial might say that we're targeting C9orf72, but we know that not everyone with a C9orf72 repeat expansion variant looks the same. So it just complicates things like research design. A lot of people with FTD, but not everyone, exhibit anosognosia or a lack of insight about their own symptoms, which can also complicate things like, who are we going to ask these questions of when we're trying to figure out if something's is effective? Can we ask the person diagnosed? Do we need someone else to report on what's going on? There are currently a lack of validated biomarkers, and there are a lot of challenges when it comes to diagnosis. We think a lot of people with FTD are ending up in psychiatric facilities, are ending up in prison, are not being given this neurological diagnosis, and are kind of never really making it to the appropriate specialty centers because it's relatively rare and people aren't very familiar with it. So again, we're not sure if it's a rare disorder or if it's really just underdiagnosed, but we know there's a real need for healthcare provider education so that people can recognize that there might be a neurodegenerative process going on. We also know, or we suspect, that there's a real differential access to diagnosis and research participation. So in this FTD Insight survey, for example, it was 92% non-Hispanic Caucasian participants. Most of them had an advanced degree. They were disproportionately female. We don't think that really reflects who has FTD. We think that reflects who has access to a diagnosis and to participating in research. And we're interested in better understanding that. And the logistics of trial participation. I think a lot of you are familiar with that. A lot of these trials require travel, require invasive procedures, and that can be really difficult, especially when there's a combination of symptoms like motor symptoms and behavioral challenges. The actual logistics are really difficult. So even though something like 85% of people say they want to participate in research, something like 10% say they actually have because of some of these logistical challenges. So to summarize kind of where we're heading, we've just been working on our new strategic plan for the coming year. So we've been thinking a lot about what we want to prioritize. We do want to strengthen and expand our registry. We think that that is a really great asset, a really great resource, both to engage people and educate them. We want to continue to enable and empower people to make informed decisions about participation in research. So a lot of that comes down to education and finding the best way to reach people. We just had our annual education conference, and I was speaking to we have a kind of a VIP volunteer group, and a lot of them were not familiar with the availability of clinical trials. And that's a problem because these are people that are the most dialed in. They're the ones that are reading our newsletters and are coming to our conferences. But something's not getting communicated because a lot of them are saying, well, I didn't want to get genetic testing because I didn't think or even counseling because I didn't think there was anything that could be done. And so we're trying to figure out how can we kind of change that dynamic. We want to continue to learn and document the diverse experiences and perspectives of people with lived experience, including historically excluded populations. And we want that information to inform research design and clinical outcome assessments, or COAs. We know we're only touching the tip of the iceberg here when we're talking to people. We want to advocate for research approaches that reflect the needs and values of people with FTD and their loved ones. So again, making sure that we're measuring what people want to be measured and also making sure that the designs are accessible. We're actually having a conference later this month all about digital biomarkers and talking about how remote technology can make things like participating in research much easier. And finally, we want to make sure that all of this information that we're capturing is being conveyed to regulatory bodies so that they're making decisions based on what matters to the community. And I will stop there and thank you. And I'm happy to field any questions, or depending on time, Danielle may want to forge ahead.
Can I ask you a question, Shana? How often are you collaborating with ALS groups then to share any of your information on biomarkers or any other information that you do collect from patients, just because there is that overlap?
Yeah, it's kind of going across different departments. So we, for example, have started working with a group out of Penn. I don't know if you know Lainey Dratch, she's a genetic counselor there, where she's been convening ALS and FTD genetic counselors to have shared conversations about the challenges and opportunities when it comes specifically to C9orf72. We haven't had a lot of formal conversations with the ALS Association. We're starting to have more conversations with IMALS. We've been talking a little bit about, is there a way to maybe have a shared conference? But we're kind of at the very, very beginning of these conversations. My guess is that actual people conducting research, I'm hoping there's some sharing of that kind of information, but we're kind of at the very beginnings of figuring out how can we make sure that we're sharing the research findings, the best care strategies, and especially for people with both ALS and FTD, what works best for this group? Because we know that there are some interventions that are great for ALS that are just not feasible for people with both ALS and FTD. So where can we kind of find that overlap and make sure that we're sharing information to both of these communities? Because we know there's people, so for example, with the Insight survey, there were a lot of people with FTD and ALS, but we think these people probably have predominant FTD symptoms, and that's kind of how they ended up in our network. And perhaps if they had initial or predominant ALS symptoms, they would end up more in the ALS advocacy organizations. So some of it is just figuring out how do we make sure people are aware of all of these organizations if they do fit into more than one category. But we don't have a very clear, systematic way of sharing all that information quite yet.
I want to read from the chat. Phil has a question. Did that answer your question? I'm sorry. Did that? Who asked that? Callie? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
Does FTD have a natural history study the recently diagnosed people can participate in? Good question.
Yes, and it's called All FTD. I believe it's allftd.org. I can check quickly. And this is an amazing natural history study. I'll drop this into the chat.
Okay.
That's going on across the United States. There's also something called GenFi, which is more based in Europe and Canada. So I'll drop that in there too. We do a lot of work with All FTD. Oops. And they enroll people with FTD, biological relatives of people with FTD. People can participate without knowing their genetic status, which is really appealing for some people. And it is a natural history study. So there's no actual intervention, but there's a lot of monitoring people over time. And they've already started putting out a lot of really interesting publications, particularly around how do we pinpoint what's happening before the disease symptoms emerge. Things like neurofilament light, which is something that you can see in the blood. And we think there are some changes in that before the clinical symptoms manifest. So how can we better identify people who are at risk for developing FTD before symptoms emerge and life gets really difficult and doing something like participating in research becomes, hard to manage. So those are two really great natural history studies. We collaborate a lot with the researchers that are involved in both of them.